This is a video on section 4.2, types of trade protection. Now in 4.1, we looked at the benefits of free trade, definition here, and now we'll look at the types of trade barriers that countries impose. These are tariffs, quotas, production subsidies, and export subsidies. Tariffs are taxes on imports, simply that. A prominent example of a country imposing tariffs was US President Trump in 2018. He thought that the cheap imports were negatively affecting the domestic steel and aluminium industries. So he thought that making imports more expensive would therefore help those domestic steel and aluminium industries. We'll see this on the diagram. Now, when we draw the diagram, we always start by looking at the US market for steel when it is open to international trade. We saw this before, so try drawing this, remembering that the US is the importing country. Okay, hopefully you drew something like this. To recap quickly, before the tariff, domestic producers made Q1, and the remainder of demand at that low price, Q1 to Q2, was filled by imports. Okay, we know from microeconomics that a tax shifts the supply curve upwards, and that is what happens here. Trump imposed a 25% tariff, so the world price and world supply shift up by 25%. Given that price rise, domestic steel producers are now willing to supply more, Q3, and domestic demanders of steel are only willing and able to purchase Q4 because of the higher price. Imports make up the shortage from Q3 to Q4. There is a lot we can read off of this diagram, so I encourage you throughout this video to draw multiple diagrams to show all of the things that we are showing. Looking at revenues before the tariff, we can see that domestic producers make Q1 and sell for PW, making this their revenue. Foreign producers also sell for PW, but make Q2 minus Q1, so that is their revenue. After the tariff, domestic steel producers get the higher price, P World plus tariff, and they sell more, so that increases their revenue. Foreign producers still receive PW, and they sell fewer. But why do they only receive price world? Because the government keeps the tariff revenue. They get this box here, the amount of imports multiplied by the tariff. Okay, next we look at welfare, consumer and producer surplus, and deadweight loss. With free trade, consumer surplus is this huge area. This is due to the much lower prices that consumers can enjoy under free trade. Producer surplus here is small, as many domestic firms cannot compete at that low world price. See if you can draw for yourself the new levels of consumer and producer surplus. Pause now and do this. Here we go. Here we can see that consumer surplus is smaller than what it was without the tariff due to the higher price, while producer surplus is larger, also due to the higher price. This leaves these parts here. This is different from before. We already know that this part is government revenue, but these other triangles, they are deadweight loss. No one gains this as surplus, and it was surplus before the tariff. We know that any tax is inefficient. We say that this part here is loss because there's more production by the inefficient US firms. And we say that this part is a loss due to less production taking place because of the higher price. Consumers don't want as much steel and aluminium as before. Okay, we'll move on to quotas. Another way that governments can protect their local industries is through imposing a limit on the number of imports that can enter the country. The Philippines consistently have a quota on the amount of rice imports that they allow. To show on a diagram, we start with the same free trade position, which is this one. Okay, good. It'll be easier to make up some numbers here to explain the concept. Let's say that at world price, domestic consumers would demand 600 tons of rice, but domestic producers are only willing to make 200 at that low price. Okay, so there's a shortage of 400 tons of rice that would be imported. The government may think that importing so much will hurt domestic producers and decides that it will only allow 250 tons to be imported. That is, they set an import quota. The excess demand of 400 can no longer be supplied with imports. They can only import 250 tonnes. So a new supply curve is created as the total that can be consumed is whatever domestic producers make plus the quota. So effectively, this is all that can be consumed. Okay, at PW, at this low price, there is a clear shortage, therefore, of 150. Domestic suppliers will only make 200, and we can only import 250. So what this does is market forces will bid the price up so that it can reach a point where it is satisfied, imports are satisfied by the quota. So it puts the price up to price world plus quota. And we'll say for these numbers are made up, that once the price goes up high enough, domestic producers will be willing to make 270 tonnes, and domestic consumers will only be willing to buy 520 tonnes, and this leaves 250. So the quota completely clears the market. So there's no shortage left over now. Okay, now we can look at revenues and welfare again for each of these diagrams. Revenues. Okay, let me see, where are we? So, before the protection, revenues are as so, just as like with the tariffs. As there is no tax, the government receives no revenue. Rather, governments hand out licenses for those who are allowed to import in. They are generally given to the exporting country, so foreign revenue is now, the domestic revenue increases, just like with tariffs, and then the foreign revenue is really this whole area, because they get to sell for the whole amount. Now, as for the welfare, consumer surplus and producer surplus are as so just like with the tariffs. And we've got these two areas of deadweight loss as before. So for the same reasons, inefficient production by the domestic producers and less production overall. Okay, and then this quota revenue is actually also a loss to the domestic market because it goes overseas. It doesn't go to the government as it used to, as it would with a tariff. It goes overseas, so it's lost. So these three areas are welfare loss. Now, many students say this diagram is the most difficult, but if you study hard, you will get it, and you can quote me on that. Sorry. Production subsidies. They can subsidise their industry that has to compete with imports. Australia used to heavily subsidise the car manufacturing industry until it became unviable to continue to do so. This diagram is a bit more straightforward. We have a free trade position. Then domestic producers receive a subsidy. We know what this looks like. Boom, there it is. They're now able to produce more at this world price, increasing from Q1 to Q3, therefore reducing the number of imports that are needed. For the revenues, we see pre-protection revenues, they're the same. Foreign revenue shrinks due to the subsidy because they don't sell as many anymore. Domestic producers are the big winners here. Not only do they sell more cars, but they also get that subsidy money from the government. They get PW from consumers, but adding the subsidy from the government, they really effectively receive PW plus subsidy. Okay, on to welfare. Consumer surplus is unaffected by the subsidy. Stays the same. Foreign revenue shrinks due to the subsidy, as we know that. Producer surplus will increase. This is just like with microeconomics. Remember, it increases like that. People used to find that hard. Here's the tricky part. We know that the government spends this amount, right? The extent of the subsidy times the quantity subsidized. But this payment is more than the extra producer surplus gained, right? So therefore, it is still a welfare loss. So we still get this as welfare loss, and that's due to inefficient production by the local Australian car manufacturers. We're not very good at it. Okay, and onto export subsidies. Last one. This is where the government pays producers per unit of the good exported. An example is India subsidizing its sugar exports. This time we go from the exporting country's perspective. You should remember this diagram. The world price is above the domestic price. So as soon as India opens up to the world, they become an exporter. Domestically, they sell Q1 and then they sell Q1 to Q2 as exports. Now, India want to boost their sugar exports, so they provide a subsidy, which of course shifts the domestic supply curve down to the right. Okay. The exporters will still export at PW, but now they receive this price plus the subsidy. So they receive PW plus the subsidy. So effectively they receive PW plus subsidy, right? Makes sense. At this higher price, they are now incentivized to produce more. At this higher price, they're willing to make Q4, while domestic consumers at that higher price only want Q3. So remember, domestic consumers pay the higher price, as the suppliers will make less available for the local market because they want to get the subsidy. They don't get that when they sell it locally. Okay, so this increases the level of exports from Q3 to Q4. So post-subsidy exports, much bigger because of the subsidy. Okay, revenues and spending. Export revenue increases. So this was what it was before, and then the export revenue increases greatly. And because that includes the subsidy that they receive for selling the export, right? Domestic consumers get less of the sugar. So there we go. Domestic spending before was this, but now they get less of the sugar and they have to pay a higher price. So they're not loving it too much. The welfare aspects are a little bit tricky. Consumers are, of course, the domestic consumers, worse off, right? They lose areas A plus B, right? Producers are, of course, better off because with the subsidy, they gain areas A, B, and C, right? The government has to spend for each unit exported, so they lose B plus C plus D. To work out the welfare loss, we consider that A is gained by both producers and consumers. A is gained by producers and is lost by consumers, right? If you look back, you'll see that. So that cancels out. So that's not welfare loss. Same with area C, gained by producers and it's lost by the government. It cancels itself out. So there's no welfare loss. But area B is lost by both consumers and the government. Even though it's gained by producers, it's lost by two other areas. So that is welfare loss. And area D as well is gained by nobody, but it's lost by the government. So both those areas are welfare loss. Okay, there is a lot to take in from that video, so make sure you go back and rewatch and take down all the details before class, okay?